again. Here we go again, and Psychoacoustics. So I have to do this without full screen stuff. Something like that. Okay, so who wants to give us a guess? How did it all start? How did the science of psychoacoustics get going? Any ideas? Let's see your historical awareness projections.
Did it come from the branch of physics?
Not really. Does this look good if I walk around the place? Nope.
I have an idea.
Yes, let's hear it.
A rock fell in ancient Greece and somebody said, what the hell happened?
When? What?
A rock fell down.
Oh, a rock fell down. Like an apple fell down and Newton said, there is gravity.
Neurology? The development of neurology?
Well, actually, it all started with very sharp knives and small mammals. Okay, so if you have a weak stomach or you have a kind of issue with abusing animals, I mean, you have to know that majority of the science in biology relies on multiplication rates of mice and rats in labs. We've tortured probably 100 billions of little rats to arrive where we are, which is horrible. And the other thing that really helped us get where we are, especially in music tech, believe it or not, is the world wars. Because the communication tech had the biggest possible impulse, financial and human-wise, when they had to, fight the world war. So in a way, and actually I would also say just that, I mean, I'll keep this lecture quite open and philosophical. We're not going to do any examination in psychoacoustics. But the interesting thing is that probably the reason why we came up with, developing science and tech is also due to the Ice Age. We were kind of stuck for too long and got very frustrated. And since then, our greed is unstoppable. But it will be stopped, I guess. So in any case, it started with sharp knives and small mammals and huge amount of stimulation into half-living or living creatures. So it all starts with exciting the eardrum acoustically and measuring the response, the neurological response. So in fact, psychoacoustics is everything between the eardrum and kind of your declaration. Okay, so did I say the best psychoacoustic joke ever? I think I did. Yeah, it's the worst one as well. But I couldn't come up with a better one, right? So you don't really, I can never be sure that you hear something. I can only be sure of you declaring that you heard something. Okay, so there's a whole lot of empirical obstacles that don't allow us to reason through from the sound into the perception. Yes?
But you said that I can't be sure you heard something. I can only be sure if you claim that you heard something.
Yeah.
Can you not test for brain activity, like if someone heard something? Because obviously, if we hear, it does send a signal to the brain.
Yeah.
Know that, okay,
Yes, you definitely can. It's really complex, the neurology that goes to figure out sound. The thing is that actually you have a few points of investigation. And first one is actually autoacoustic emissions. It's not even part of the slideshow, actually. But if you go to an audiologist who is supposed to check your hearing, well, first thing, you might be disappointed. The most recent one I saw from a friend, it went up to 8K. Traditionally, they went up only to 4K. So it's the kind of investigation into your hearing that is focused around speech perception and not necessarily about, ultrasonic near frequencies. So they don't really tell you how suitable your hearing is, for critical listening or whatever. And autoacoustic emissions are essentially sounds emitted by the ear. Okay, you might not be aware of this, but the ear emits sounds in response to what it receives So you can kind of test the activity of the ear itself by recording audio signal from it. Okay, these are called autoacoustic emissions. And then down the line, I mean, the neurology of hearing is fascinating, totally amazing. In fact, I think the guy is called Brown. I should look it up. There is a series of lectures for essentially biology students on, or neurology students more specifically, on perception. So there's about 10 lectures on visual perception and 10 lectures on audio perception. And it's packed with brain regions, you know, kind of names that you don't really remember, unless, you know, it's the after party after Luke Vipers. Suddenly remember olivatory, no, olive complex. I don't know. I don't even know. It's not that. We're not there yet, but it's kind of, you know, packed with complex or difficult to remember names. But in essence, what it is, the interesting thing is, I mean, the main point is, so yeah, you could potentially plug in there and you have magnetic resonance imaging for the brain. But the point is that our understanding of the brain is not that detailed. In fact, our understanding of the perception, the attention is kind of there. We know what are the regions for attention. So, but still there is a gap, right? So you can actually measure the brain activity in the, I didn't prepare for the neurology here. I forget this name as well. What's the center for audio perception? I don't even remember. Something cortex, yeah. So, but still, you know, even if there is activity in the brain, there is no way of verifying that you are an active agent with free will. You know.
Yeah.
So you could as well be an automate, an automaton. You know, there is no way of verifying this empirically. I mean, the only way to verify it is for someone to look into your eyes like, are you sane, bro? And you're like, yeah, man. And that's kind of the maximum we can reach in terms of verifying that there is a sense of agency in other people. And especially because these days, scientists are more and more reluctant to accept the notion of free will, which we can talk about briefly. I mean, in essence, absolute free will is totally questionable. The question actually evolves around free agency and the degree of agency. So what are the points? And in fact, what I'm convinced of, and I just heard it from a friend as well, really interesting, he says that the only point in life when you take a decision, when you're thinking, when your brain works, is when you change your mind. Okay, so most of our activity, daily stuff, including this lecture, I've done a few psychoacoustics lecture, they're fairly automatic. And I could change my mind and do something funny, but in a way that's also not going to prove anything because I always change my mind and do something funny. So there's a kind of a recursive loop in the definition of, you know, agency, and you can't really pick it apart. So yeah. Now, so the neurology. I mean, the first important thing, the kind of thing you can remember as a punchline. I don't know if you can chat up someone with this line. I haven't really tried, but you don't see pixels. Okay, we have in neurology, cognitive science, which is really developed hugely in the past decades. We have a term homunculus, yeah? Which is the idea that there is a little human somewhere inside your brain, which is you, who has the brain, who has the body, who has inputs, who has outputs, who has intelligence and all of that. And that's a really weak attempt at understanding or modeling what the hell may be going on. And it actually arises from our way of speaking about human condition. And the funny thing, which is, you know, the ownership of the self, and in fact the division of me and the self, right? And it all starts when mommy tells you, why don't you just control yourself? And you probably, for the first few years, you're like, mommy, that makes no sense. And then you just accept it. That's how people talk about this. But it actually does not really make sense to divide yourself up into the controller and the follower of the instruction, which is probably the most harmful thing I think we inherit, because by the age you're grown up or almost there or beyond, you essentially end up with instructing yourself continuously, right? So we have an internal dialogue. It goes blah, blah, this and that, balancing perspectives, and then there is an instruction, and then the self is supposed to execute this instruction, which is a total nonsense, in my opinion. Okay, so in psychoacoustics, what we're dealing is with perception, right? The neurology of it and a few other aspects. It all started with cutting up little mice and figuring out how the neurons respond, how the cochlea, the whole physiology. I won't go into detail. But I think what is crucial is that we don't see pixels and we don't really hear sound sources like that. So the point to understand is that our perception is a very complex construct. We have the idea that it is our insight into what is real, and probably there is no better insight in what is real, but still it is a very complex construct. So typically with vision, for example, you have, the way this works is with layers of neurons, which kind of have separate function. So when you see something, the first thing you see is whether it's threatening or not. Okay, so actually what you have is a very complex automated system that will essentially figure out what you see. Then it will figure out whether this is dangerous to you or not, and that will be the first thing you're aware of. So actually build up this whole perception, then you really narrow it down to the most crucial thing, which is life-threatening or not, and that is the first thing you perceive, right? So it is, and that's crucial because you don't hear the details, you can pay attention to the details. You don't see pixels, you can examine the pixels. Well, there's not even pixels, but you can spatially examine what you see in detail. But it doesn't strike you, so there is no screen with the homunculus in the brain seeing it all happen and kind of pulling levers. But in fact, the self is this perception, among other things as well. So the idea, that the problem with the paradigm is essentially the assumption that we are linear thinking beings, whereas we have a massively parallel set of activities going on. Like some of you notice now because you're doing other things in the same time as well, and it kind of works. Right? And the funny thing is that if you are motivated or forced to do a single thing, actually force linear thinking, which is something that I'm doing now, but I escape very readily and come back to stuff, like I just did. But in fact, if you're forced into linear thinking, into being conclusive, then you get tired. Okay, so after this lecture, I'll be like, okay, I've lost a bit, but I'll regain, it's not an issue. But if I had to do this for hours, 3-4 hours, I'd probably drop dead. Okay, so, but if I just have to chat with you guys for 3-4 hours, we'd probably get along quite well, you know. We might actually even increase the sense of energy and motivation through feeling free to feel, you know, being parallelly active with our brains and all the rest. So it's not the natural function of the brain to really be focused and linear like that. Okay, so all of these things happen parallel, and then, well, I mean, it's just totally fascinating. The thing where it develops from, so it started with cutting up brains and heads of mammalians, and then it stopped at some point, obviously. Ethics have improved, so you can't really do this too much anymore, although rats and mice are not being protected much. Because then it went into listening tests. Okay, so the whole body of kind of standard historical psychoacoustics is about beeps and blops and noises and sine waves. And the point is that we had a kind of a, very, very detailed empirical approach. Do you hear this? Do you don't hear that? Psychoacoustics is full of J and Ds, which are just noticeable differences, right? Because with the machinery, you can set, two frequencies really close together, and then you can set them so close together that people cannot report a difference, and that's just noticeable difference in frequency. You can do the same with amplitude. You can do the same with many other things. But probably the most interesting thing to kind of assume already is that every aspect of audio perception is easily influenced by every other aspect. So we kind of live in a paradigm where things are necessarily separate. And one of my dear anecdotes is about frequency and time. Okay, because as an advanced monkey, at some point we were, checking the time by looking at our wrists, equipped with these machineries, which is not the case anymore. So the time was kind of there, or on the clock, or whatever, on the church, and the frequency was here. So for us, it is kind of evident that they are two separate things, right? But are they? No, right? Frequency and time are intertwined concepts, and you cannot separate one from the other. In fact, you could say that in a very short amount of time, a very low frequency cannot even exist, which is kind of true. Although this is a funny one. Are you brainy already? Have you slept well? It's a really funny one, because I spent about 5 years saying this, and then I think it was actually here in this lecture theater, and I was like, impulse. And I didn't tell it to anyone. I was just like, oh no, I hope no one remembers this. But then I figured out what's the issue. So what I just said, right, is that there cannot be a very low frequency in a very short span of time. So how about the impulse? An impulse is a flat spectral phenomenon, right? It has, like white noise, an impulse has all the frequencies, so to speak, horrible expression. So what the hell? Any clues? Because impulse is extremely short, and it supposedly has bass frequencies. So what's going on here? Which one of the statements has an issue? Good guess. And me most of all. So the thing is that actually the second statement is more problematic, because it's not the impulse, it is the impulse plus the silence after it. You see, so if you don't have the sufficient silence after the impulse, it actually won't have the bass frequencies. The problem is that we can't just stop time, so there will be time after, right? So the impulse will eventually have all the bass frequencies as the time unfolds, which is a funny thing. After a whole lot of cutting up the neurological pathways and the ears and all the rest, we got into these test tones. So we have quite a few decades of test tone psychoacoustics, and then we kind of have a new page, new morning, where people realize that that's all good and fine, but you shouldn't really directly conclude anything about acoustical sounds based on the test tones. Okay, so initially it was like, okay, if we know everything about the responses we have to all the possible frequency, all the possible bandwidths, all the possible amplitudes, so that's your kind of, slice it up and then figure out every little detail, and then we will know everything about the big picture. That kind of attitude in science is long gone already, kind of. So we now know, as a matter of fact, that if we slice everything up and know all the details about all the components of everything, it will not tell us how the thing functions as a whole. Okay, so there is a level of complexity that is not explained by the elements. In fact, I would easily stretch this to say that music is just a very good proof of this, because, and that was about yesterday's gig, this was the most horrible thing, because they've actually used all the cool and worthwhile elements, but there was just no real music going on, right? So even if you take all the possible elements, and that's the funny thing, because if you have a sense for how a complex system breathes and kind of does its thing, stays alive or becomes alive or gets, born, then you really very quickly start to understand that the elements are not as crucial. It is more the relationship of the elements, right? So if you keep tuning the sound of your snare drum for 2 days, you're likely to realize that it was all futile, because it's not about that degree of detail. I had another student from Hungary the other day. He was like, yeah man, they're all crazy about Rainbow for Max MSP, because now you can export audio units and all the rest with Max MSP, and you can export C++ code, you can export all sorts of things but it's not from Max MSP patches. You have to build a separate patch, and it's a kind of a stupid version of Max MSP, which is not too clever anyway. So I'm not horribly excited, but they were, and he was like, yeah man, but you won't believe it, I've tested it, I don't know, what was it, from Max for Live, and then he tested it as a VST, and he says he hears the difference. And I'm like, okay, well, why don't you, and I'm like, okay, so did you do a double blind test? No, he cannot do a double blind, he's a single person. Did you do a blind test? And he's like, well, no, because I cannot do it. It's like, send me the files, and I'll send it back to you, renamed and scrambled. And it was really funny, because he sent me 2 files, right, the things to compare. I sent him back 8 files. So, we have some chance of seeing what is going on. And his score was 50%. So he guessed it 50% of the time, which means random. So no chance he can hear the difference. Evidently, he did hear the difference. But the funniest thing is that when he listened to this, like, I'm sure number 2 is, I don't know, Max for Live. And I'm like, okay, it was, right? But overall, he had a 50% guess rate. So it's a really tricky thing to consider. But in any case, the kind of differences that you may have from, the exact type of gear that you use, this or that, are really, really minute in relation to the wholeness of music. Yes?
What absolutes can we hold in psychoacoustics then?
Absolutes. Well, we can hold a lot of absolutes about test tones, right?
Test tones?
Huh?
Test tones.
Test tones, sine waves, noises, and impulses. Right? So all of those things are absolute in the sense that we have an average value across the population, and we can also measure these things.
Like the proximity effect and the bandwidth of like hearing and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, you can measure the sensitivity of hearing. Proximity effect is something that has to do with unidirectional receivers, really, microphones. Okay, even an omnidirectional microphone won't necessarily have a proximity effect. But sound sources which have directivity will also have a sense of proximity effect, by the way. But it's not necessarily psychoacoustical. We will actually go through some psychoacoustical things which are kind of factual, like that. But I just try to set the stage for not, jumping to conclusions in what the acoustic environment does. Another interesting anecdote, I'll probably, as I said, I would enjoy just, chatting like this anyway, more than going through all the details, but we will do. But a funny anecdote which kind of changed my perspective. I'm kind of have damaged hearing for obvious reasons. If I swap the headphones left, right, I kind of hear a different mix, which is not a good sign.
Why is that?
I just played drums as a kid, and
No, like why if you change and you hear the difference, it means like you're...
Yeah, left, right is out of order. Um, so, but I'm still quite, you know, I think it's not necessarily about what you hear, but how much attention you can pay to the sound you hear, and that definitely has to do with motivation. So if you're really motivated to hear something, you can kind of find it in your perception.
What about the other way? If you're motivated to erase that?
To erase that, well, I'm not sure. The kind of it's a contradictory term, I would think, because motivation implies the necessity to be active, and in order not to hear anything, you have to dump down. You have to lose the activity. You have to be like limp. You be like, you know, you have to be to in a single second just drop dead, and kind of switch yourself off. And if you're motivated, that's the exact thing you cannot do. That's why you cannot sleep at will, right? It's a similar thing. You cannot drop dead at will because it necessitates the lack of will, in a way.
I thought that we knew that there are some things that our perception does filter out and we're not being present towards.
You mean, yes, well, there are, the attention in the brain is kind of clear where it is, what it does, how much it can get. You can trace certain aspects of attention.
So
But
if you're listening to like a piece of music and you're focusing on the bass part,
yeah,
and on the same side, you're also not listening to the rest.
yeah.
Surely it's the same thing.
Same as what?
Surely this is also then us actively not listening to things.
No, by no means. No. Because the window of attention is much smaller than the bandwidth of your perception. So you're still hearing it. In fact, there's a whole lot of experiments where you can receive information subliminally. Right, this works. So I can prime you to like or dislike something without you noticing.
Yeah.
Marketing people know this very well.
Even with lucid dreamings now.
With what?
Lucid dreams.
Oh, what's the? I mean, what about?
There's a recent research where they basically communicated through a lucid dream.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah.
But in any case, I was about to say something about this amazing thing that happened to me. One day, I swam maybe for an hour. I saw a little kind of island and I was like, okay, I'll just go back and forth, and then it was really far away, you know. But I kind of did it, and I came out of the water an hour later and I heard everything. I heard high frequencies like never before. All the details. It was tremendous. It lasted for about half an hour as well. It kind of decayed slowly, but my perception opened up hugely. And it could be due to multiple factors. I think there's, my Eustachian tubes are not in great shape either. And I think most of all it is the adaptation of the brain, right? So it kind of proves that it's not necessarily, at least in my case, a physiological issue with hearing. It's more of a motivational and adaptational issue. So if you don't hear high frequencies for an extended amount of time, your brain will become really alert and sensitive to those things.
There's
Right?
tinnitus as well.
There is tinnitus, yeah. I don't have it.
I heard that tinnitus is basically sometimes it can be created by, for example, like if you put in noise isolating headphones, that the brain cannot comprehend the fact that there's no sound, so it creates some kind of a signal to alert itself.
I would be a bit skeptical about that description. I mean, there are a lot of evidences about the feedback mechanisms, kind of the top-down channels in the perception. In fact, ears are active in many different ways. But there is still some, I would say, misconception lurking in the way even professionals describe certain things in terms of replacing the missing bit. Okay, that's one of your perceptual abilities that, if you see this circle here, right? But if I obscure most of it and you see only a few bits of the contour, you kind of see that there is a circle behind something. Okay, so the question is, what is an appropriate way of describing this? And I would argue that saying that the brain replaces the missing bits is just not an appropriate way of describing this. To me, the appropriate way is to say that there is sufficient triggering going on. You cross the perceptual threshold. So it's not like the brain has to replace the missing bits. The brain has to be sufficiently excited to produce a perception. So about producing perception, it's very interesting. I kind of had, at some point or a few years, a decade or so, I was kind of developing some mystification of the human condition. And one of the key things that people normally latch onto is the sense of synchronicity. Okay, when things kind of happen simultaneously, kind of seem inevitable. I just thought about you, gave me a call, things like this. And it was all good and well until I read about the fact that if I touch my nose with a finger, then the latency, neurological latency, which is reporting the sensation in the finger, is sufficient for me to potentially perceive that the sensation comes into the finger first and then into the nose. Try it, guys, don't be afraid. Touch your nose and see if it's possible for you to feel two events. First one in the finger and then one and then one in the nose. And you can do this after.
Oh, it fucks me up.
You can try it in an after party setting as well. So the question is, or the conclusion that I had is that the synchronicity is a constructed perception, right? So and that's the really neat thing. Thereby, I will never be able. It's impossible for me to figure out whether something is synchronous, right? And that's a really powerful thing, because every thing that I have a sense for is the thing I will never touch directly, right? Because if I have an apparatus for hearing sound, which kind of makes it a bit more complex in this discussion, but you try to extrapolate it, it's easier to figure it in the context of synchronicity. If I have a machinery that will produce a sense of synchronous events, and what it does, it either reports synchronous events or asynchronous events, that very thing is the reason why I will never know whether there is synchronicity or not. Because I know exactly that my apparatus is constructing one or the other, right? So it's a kind of a funny thing to realize. So shall we go to the timeline of the lecture? Did I wake you up enough, put you to sleep, or both at the same time? You want to see my Hong Kong visa? Okay. Let's look. I mean, there's millions of things to talk about here. It's really exciting domain. It's a lot of reading you can do. I can definitely recommend some lectures and all the rest. But yeah, I don't know. The point to understand is, what we can assume and what we cannot assume. And the point for us in this context is to separate the acoustics, the actual empirical science that comes from physics, from perception, okay, and to see the meaning of this division and just not to jump to conclusions. That's the biggest thing that we're after here. So briefly about the physiology, I mean, there is a lot of resources for this. If you're interested to see, microscopic photography and all the rest, it's all available now. But in essence, one of the things that is not often talked about, typically, I don't know if you've noticed, it's kind of an issue, but I always avoid to talk about things which are readily available in the pool of human knowledge. And I'm mostly interested in the things that you cannot find otherwise. So I kind of assuming that if you're, motivated to do this, you probably already found out most of the facts that are readily available. And if you're not, then who cares anyway, right? So I'm always trying to fill up the bits that are kind of more challenging, more provocative, subversive approaches, rather than be like, okay, this is the middle of the road, straight up, theory. So I'm kind of avoiding all that narrative. But what's interesting here is that we actually have an impedance issue. So, one of the things to say, first of all, ear is a horribly complex thing together with brainstem and all the other things, which is kind of probably the best argument for frequency selectivity of biological tissue. Okay, so if you hear these stories or read this stuff, I don't know why it spreads. I have a few guesses, I won't go into that. But the kind of thing that a certain frequency will harm you and certain frequency is beneficial and all the rest. Biological tissue is not sensitive to frequency. If it was, we wouldn't evolve this hugely complex thing, which is the only thing which is frequency selective, right? So the point is that if there is a brown noise, right,
The only thing that is frequency selective.
To this degree, yeah. Because, if I want to destroy my liver, with sound rather than booze, for some reason, I could probably create an acoustic signal which is sufficiently loud in an appropriate bandwidth, frequency band, such to destroy my liver. But it's not going to be one specific frequency.
What about your eyes?
What about them?
They're also frequency selective, aren't they?
Well, they are sensitive to vibration, but not frequency selective. In order to evolve frequency selectivity, it has to get really complex, right? So if my eyes feels weird at a very loud, 10K tone, it will also feel at 10.1K and 9.9. So there's a bandwidth within which you are sensitive. And it's not a frequency selective thing. There's not a specific frequency which triggers it, and the one next to it doesn't. And the other thing is there is no such thing as one frequency and the one next to it either, right? Yeah. So it's kind of, I'm trying to break loose some of the, and if you've seen the reading list, I don't know how much you've engaged with it, but if you get to start to read any of these books, you will understand that the complexity of relationships is huge. And it's sufficient to, spend half an hour browsing through these books to hopefully come out at the other end and say, as soon as I hear someone say something fascinating, which is a simple relationship, I know it's bloody crap, right? Because it's almost impossible. It's our tendency to like and prefer simple explanations and simple relationships, and it can give me a sense of catharsis, and I feel like I know something, which is great, but I can induce that chemically as well and in other ways. So it doesn't really, compute to be so malleable, be lacking your critical thinking in assuming all the things that we are presented, especially when they're simple things that connect really distant domains. Already within a single domain of scientific inquiry, you probably need a few decades to really understand the ins and outs of it. And then someone comes along and says, oh, well, this one thing from one domain directly maps to this other domain, and if this, then that. And you're like, oh, that's great. And I've seen it, and therefore it is true. I don't know what is the reasoning there. But the point is that there is no reasoning. We have evolved screens only very recently. And I'm kind of convinced that everything you see on a screen directly connects to the neurology of divine presence. Because, if you think about 10,000s of years, 100,000s of years of monkeys evolving, the sense of divine was kind of present throughout, it seems. And it's that presence which has no material substance, which is spiritual, whatever. and now the screens are that. So even though if I ask you, is the thing on you see on your screen divine, you'll probably say no, right? But
was it traced though?
but just a second, but subconsciously it is. That's the point. It is the ultimate point of reference, more so than living people around us.
What do you mean by divine presence?
Well, it's
Sense of
divine presence.
Yeah. What is
Well,
that?
it's the kind of thing that we evolved to have. You know, we evolved to have because in essence what we have is the ability. It's all. I typically like to call this unnecessary extrapolation, and it's not even my idea. I can refer you to some books. So the point is that as soon as I realize that, you know, I have an object, I don't know, I love to throw things around in class. Here is my keys, and if I, you know, do a little bit of force, that's how high it went. If I, you know, put more force, it jumps more, okay? So I can kind of explain this phenomenon. I can set up a relationship between the amount of force and the height of, you know, the keys in this experiment. And that's fine, but the funny thing is we end up thinking that this type of basic causality has to hold. It's a kind of a hysterical thing in the brain that this must be the case, right? We're chasing this explanation and a set of explanations which will explain
That's
everything.
A cognitive mechanism, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why like cognitive dissonance is created when, you know, things don't hold up.
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of produce this necessity of explanation, and then comes in the divine presence where there is no explanation, but there is a sense of understanding. Or indeed, there is no explanation and no sense of understanding, at which point I'm praying to God to save me from one or the other thing. So
I didn't understand the connection.
and then also there is a sense of authority, right? So in a way we are brought up by certain authoritative methods, and then what happens is we internalize this authority, and that's what I talked about earlier. We end up instructing ourselves, right? So that sense of and then most of all the sense of necessary subject. Okay, so the way that our language works and our basic perception work has yielded the situation whereby we don't really describe processes, we describe agents and activities. So when we see something happen, the thing that comes to our mind is who's done it, who's responsible, why did it happen? So we kind of seek something behind the process that's supposed to set the process in motion, which is an anthropomorphism. It's just the way that human mind approaches stuff, right? It could just as well be a process, right? And it's again the same question that we started with, you know, is sound a wave or a particle? No, both waves and particles are models, the ways we can approach these phenomena meaningfully. So in that same way, in this case, it's all just our projection rather than, you know, insight into reality or something like that. Cool. First slide. I love this. And we have half an hour left.
I'm sure they'll appreciate it in Hong Kong, you know.
Hi?
I'm sure they'll appreciate it in Hong Kong, you know.
Oh, great. I still have to see if I get there. Although it's really interesting. I'm supposed to do interaction design, which is I did it once already, and it's software engineers mostly and kind of media students, but it's really cool because actually the pinnacle of interaction design is in designing musical instruments. So everything else falls into place if you understand that well, and that was part of my studies. So it's really exciting. Okay, some terms here. Peripheral auditory system. Okay, so everything that is outside of the brain, pretty much. Pinny, ear flaps, unique and growing. You can probably guess many things from that. The interesting thing is that, we'll talk about, I'll just name these things. If you're interested, you can look them up. Eardrum, you're probably aware of this. So I actually started to say something about the impedance thing, right? So the thing is that in the cochlea, we have a liquid, in which the membrane hangs, so to speak. However, the sound is transmitted in air. Now the issue is that if I have airborne sound, the water surface, the liquid surface, will reflect a huge amount of energy. It is a very reflective boundary, right? So if you remember from boundaries, what we have is that essentially the steepness of impedance change, right? So how abruptly it changes is related to the amount of reflection. So if I find a way to gently change impedance rather than abruptly, what I will have is higher levels of transmission, lower levels of reflection. Okay, so this is your trumpet flare. Okay, so the trumpet flare, if I had the end of a pipe just like that, it is a very abrupt impedance change and it will reflect a lot of energy. If I have a flare, what happens is that the impedance change is gradual and there is less reflection. Okay, so this is an overarching principle. Now, what we have in the ear is transmission from air to liquid. If we just had the surface of the liquid, we would have too much reflection, there wouldn't be much coming through. So we actually have an impedance correcting mechanism, which is mechanical one, which is the ossicles. Okay, so these tiny bones that transmit vibration essentially have two membranes attached. One is the eardrum, the one is the oval window in the cochlea, and between those there is a mechanical connection. And this is actually something which is crucial for there to be a good amount of transmission, which is really funny because if it was just liquid exposed, it would reflect quite a lot. That's one of the interesting things that is not typically discussed. Okay, so that's kind of an impedance mechanism, and then once we are in the cochlea, essentially we have tonotopy. So the frequency maps to position. That's the main thing here. The way the cochlea looks like and behaves like it's kind of in a, what is this? Shell shape, yes, or can't think of it now. In any case, what you have is that it starts off spiral, yes. It starts off wider and thicker, and it ends up narrower and thinner as it goes in the spiral. And what you have is that the base frequencies will make large excursion at the end, at the far end, and the high frequencies will make large excursions at the very beginning of the membrane. Okay, so it's a kind of a membrane rolled up like that, and if it's a low frequency, and you can look up, there's a lot of videos of this as well, it's really kind of cool to see. So if you're fascinated by looking at detail of some physiology, you should find interesting things. Now, that's one thing, and unfortunately, typically the only thing that is widely understood. However, we have phase locking going on as well, which is really crucial, especially for pitch perception. Okay, so it's not only tonotopy, it's not only frequency to position, it is the firing of the neurons which come in and out of sync, and increasingly more things are explained by these synchronous activities or indeed asynchronous activities rather than just the, so to speak, spectral characteristic of the incoming signal. And those two things are, kind of intertwined and really complex. In fact, what you can say is that the visual perception actually employs much more neural tissue, but the auditory perception is more layered, which is really interesting kind of comparison, because the case is that in order for you guys to hear my voice and figure out that that's a single sound source and attend to it, it's really complex, right? So it is very, very complex, because you understand that based on the location response based on the synchronicity of neural firing, all of this is constructed, right? So it is horribly complex. What are the other few interesting things? It is an active system. So one of the things probably worth knowing is the Stampedius reflex, which kind of logs the bones a bit. So it's a kind of a mechanical noise suppression, right? And it is fairly quick, but not massively. So if you're exposed to 130 dB in an instant, you will suffer hearing loss, mechanical. But if it has a fade in, so to speak, you won't, because the neurology will actively block the bones from moving, immediately stop this madness going on, right? So that's one thing. And then there is other feedback mechanisms as well, other active properties. For example, with your location response, what happens is that you are actively dampening the membrane locations near where you have the stimulation. So if I get that's why you can actually learn pitch perception, because you're kind of fortifying, you're training the feedback system, the active system, because as you get a certain frequency, you can actually make the membrane peak narrower by pushing down next to it, so to speak. So there are two types of hair cells in the membrane. There's a lot of physiology there. I'm just kind of highlighting the really interesting things that may, serve you. So in any case, a lot of feedback. It's not a passive system. It's not like, I get what's available and then that's it. So there is a lot of active control of the perceptual peripheral auditory system, and then comes in the thing about attention and all the other complications. So it's quite complex. Another thing which is not available to read in most textbooks is kind of more recent finding and more recent experiments showing that actually the auditory nerve is also frequency selective. So throughout the auditory system, it's not just the cochlear membrane, there is filtering going on in each neuron, so to speak. And then they are arranged such that you have ones that filter more bass and highs and mids. So it's a kind of an evolved system, which tells you that it's not by design, which tells you that the functionality is just an approach how we try to understand it, right? I mean, it's just mind-blowing, because these cells are all alive themselves, and, you can keep them alive in a petri dish, and, we're kind of made up of a lot of little animals, more so than anything. And, the amount of species of cells that do just hearing, it's just too much to fathom. Okay, if you want to approach peripheral processing in some detail, kind of understand it, the issue is that the books and the papers on this, the terminology that they use is neuroscience, and it's really alien to us typically. The one gateway into understanding more of this is looking at models of peripheral processing, where we encounter the kind of terms that we are familiar with as filters, compression. Because typically what you can do is you can build a model, a signal processing model of peripheral hearing. Yeah, I'll skip that if you're interested. Okay, so the first main thing that people started measuring is the sense of loudness, right? So as soon as you could measure the sound pressure level, you could ask people how loud it is. People started doing experiments in this domain.
Can you remind the difference between like digital dBs rather than like the other dBs? Because I forgot.
There is no digital dBs.
I mean, like in
SPL.
Yeah, there's SPL, but like because like the relationship, because like if you like take -3 dB in your DAW, basically you're halving the perception, right? The amplitude.
Well, that's one of the things I would want to discuss. So I will do that and hopefully answer the question as well. So the thing is that I'm kind of opposed to the mainstream view here, that saying that something is twice as loud is meaningful. And indeed, it kind of relates to loudness. So actually, I mean, I won't go into the details here, but the point is that based on the measurement, this is your equal loudness contour, right? So this is a really crucial graph that tells you what are the parameters that yield the same loudness. Okay, so you have frequency and actual sound pressure level, right? So the way to read this is to say that if I want to perceive an equally loud sound, I don't know, this is probably 1K, this is probably 40 hertz, 30 hertz here. So if I want a 30 hertz sound to be as loud as a 3K sound, this one here, I actually need 25 dB louder bass. Okay? Technically, measured with an SPL meter. Okay, so you have to push much more energy into bass if you are to perceive it as equally loud.
Yeah.
And equal loudness perception kind of makes sense, because what I can do is I can make an experiment when I have a B and I can have a volume knob on the B, and the experiment says, change the volume of the B signal until you perceive it to be equally loud, and then you can take your time, A, B, okay, I think they're equally loud now, and done with. So you can kind of do these things meaningfully. But if I give you two signals, or actually the same signal, which is A-B set up such that I can change the volume of one, and I ask you to set it to be twice as loud. That's a really kind of an open question. It is the case that majority of psychoacousticians don't question this. They don't have a problem with this. So in essence, what you have is that we derive phones and sounds from dB via the measurement, the psychoacoustic measurement. And supposedly the sounds after the phones, I won't get into details there, but they have this scalability. So if something is 3 phones, then it's twice as loud as 1.5 phones, some such thing. But to me, that's not crucial. The interesting thing to understand is that it's really complex. It's totally nonlinear. Okay, and understanding this graph is actually quite interesting. Could anyone tell me, what does it mean that the lines are more spaced here in the mids than in the bass frequency? So what does the spacing of the lines tell us?
The amount of amplitude per frequency, like the amount of SPL.
There is no such thing as amount of SPL.
At the lower frequencies, there's less of a difference between each loudness levels.
Yes.
So
So
as you go on, there's much bigger.
exactly.
Yeah.
So can you formulate this by using the term dynamics and sensitivity?
So simply, we're less sensitive to lower frequencies.
At low frequencies, we are less sensitive to dynamics change or dynamics contrast. Okay, that's great. So where are we the most sensitive?
Mid-range.
Well, I'm kind of looking at it. The thing is that, you see, in terms of the sensitivity, so this curve here is the threshold of hearing. So this means that actually at 2K, 3K, I can hear a very, very soft sound. So actually, if you want to if you invert this graph, then you will have, the filter, right? Because it's kind of peaking at that frequency if you think about it that way. Okay, so this is definitely the region where we are most sensitive. But you see that there are some funny things. So for example, here it's kind of flat, but here it's curved again, right? So what you want, if you want to find the region of most dramatic sensitivity to dynamics, then you're trying to find regions where you have most distance between lines. So typically it's all about 10 dB distance here, so you can kind of play a game and try to find where there is more distance. But this, for example, seems like it's more than 10. So there is some increased sensitivity there. Okay, so in any case, the point is that loudness is very complex to really analyze thoroughly. It depends on frequency, obviously. It depends on bandwidth. Okay, so if you have a hi-fi amp, or you've seen one, it is likely that it has a loudness button. What does it do? It increases bass and trebles. And why does that give us a sense of a louder sound source? Because it increases bandwidth. Okay, and this will go down to critical bands, which I will try to introduce. Here are bits about loudness measurement, and this is the bit about critical distance. By the way, I think it says somewhere the loudness also depends on sound duration, believe it or not. Okay, so if you have very short sounds, shorter than 0.2 seconds, they seem louder. Okay, so it's also dependent on duration. It's dependent on frequency, and it's dependent on bandwidth, which is probably the most complex thing to kind of get our heads around at this stage.
Why is it, by the way?
What, critical bandwidth?
No, the shorter the sound, the higher.
Well, there is a thing that we call time integration window of hearing. Okay, so there are a few things here. So for example, if you have two sounds happening very quickly one after the other, you will typically recognize the two different sources, but you won't be able to say which one came first. Okay, so there is something to be said about perception in the sense that you don't hear moment by moment, and there is no such thing as moment by moment anyway, but you actually have a time integration window. So if something happens within a certain amount of time, you grasp it, but you cannot grasp the detail within that time window. And the funny thing is that they found is that the percussionists, they can hear the precedence in this scenario if the sound sources are familiar, percussive sounds. And the explanation is that they actually know the timbre of different flams. I mean, even though you cannot say which sound came first from, you kind of learn by playing percussion to figure out which one came first in this scenario. Okay, now about the critical band. So the first experiment that showed us something along those lines, that there's something funny happening, is that if you have a noise source with increasing bandwidth, but of fixed RMS, so fixed energy in the signal, which means that, you know, initially it is peaking like this, and then it's broader but lower, the peak. So the energy is constant, but the bandwidth is increasing. There will be a point where you suddenly hear an increase in loudness. So technically there is no increase in loudness, there is no increase in the signal energy, there is only increase in bandwidth. You're listening to this, it sounds like what it does, and suddenly you hear it to be louder. Okay? And that is the first experiment that showed critical bandwidth, and after that there came many, many more. And that is the graph that tells you essentially what you expect here. So this is at 1 kilohertz. If I have a bandwidth up until 160 hertz, I will hear the same loudness, and then suddenly it jumps or it starts increasing, and I hear it increasingly louder as the bandwidth extends. Okay? And the kind of explanation here is that you are triggering more hair cells, more neural activity gives you a sense of more loudness. Okay, so again, the physiology of hearing is not a measurement device, it's a life-saving device, or kind of a mating competition device as well, and many other things. Okay, so that's the crucial thing here, and this will also change with level. Okay, so that's the tricky thing about psychoacoustics, that when you measure something at a single frequency, at a single bandwidth, with a single type of stimulus, in this case noise, that's only one point, and actually everything that you change about this will make a different result. So it's very convoluted and quite difficult to make sense of it as well. Okay, so that's critical bandwidth, quite crucial. I'm puzzled why I don't have this other slide here of, oh yeah, here they come, critical bands. So that's kind of the view of that experiment, where you have increasing bandwidth. And in fact, there are other things here as well, in terms of pure tone versus noise. I'll kind of skip through these things. The thing that I wanted to show you is this one. So this is because the critical bands, the question is, okay, so what is the width of critical bands? And the answer is it varies, okay? And it becomes kind of logarithmic after a certain range. What's funny about this graph? So it's trying to tell us what is the critical bandwidth. At 100 hertz, it is about 90 hertz. At 200 hertz, it's still kind of the same, and then it gets progressively larger. But what's funny about this graph?
It goes up to 100K.
Yeah. What the hell? So it's probably mice again. Who knows? We'd have to look it up. In any case, there's the reference. You can look it up if you're interested. Cool. I'm going to check the time briefly. We have 10 minutes, sort of. So I said a few things about loudness perception. Masking is part of that. So what happens typically is that louder sounds will mask softer sounds, right? Which means that you don't hear the softer one. And this depends on frequency as well, such that a low frequency will mask a high frequency more easily. That's essentially the mechanism there. This is another one of those interesting graphs to consider understanding.
Blend with the perception graph, because if you need like a bigger SPL to perceive low frequencies, how come low frequencies will mask better higher frequencies?
Well, how come there is a lot of explanation in terms of the neurological, properties of the system. The two don't conflict, right? So I can still measure everything needed to plot this graph and everything needed to plot the other graph. There are two different ways of approaching it. They don't necessarily contradict, right? So this graph, what it says, essentially, is that if you have a tone at this frequency, 400 hertz, then everything, and it's here 80 dB, right? So everything that falls below this curve will be inaudible. Okay? So that's the kind of the veil of that stimulus. So if you have a frequency there at this loudness, everything here underneath won't be audible, and everything underneath here won't be audible. So you kind of see the asymmetry, that a frequency, a stimulus, will mask higher frequency more readily than the lower frequency. And then you can also start thinking about, okay, the distance of the lines, what the hell is this hump here? In any case, it's you just have to imagine millions of cells doing this job, and each one is kind of a random agent as well, might fail or might not fail. So it's just fascinating that we get something reliable. And in fact, we don't, because everyone will, have a different curve like that and all the rest. So that's frequency masking, but we also have temporal masking. believe it or not. So if you have a very loud sound preceding a softer sound, you won't hear a softer sound. And the funny thing is that we have forward and backwards temporal masking, which means that I can actually have a soft sound happen before the loud sound, and the loud sound will still mask it. Okay, so again, the time integration window, which kind of shows that we don't hear things in sequence, we hear them in chunks, so to speak. Okay, pitch perception. So crucially, frequency is something which is a technically defined term, okay? Pitch is a perceptual phenomenon. Crucial. Please try to make this distinction every time you use these words. There are things like ambiguous pitch, right? So typically bell sounds will give you, or a variety of people, a different perception of what is the fundamental pitch of the stimulus, okay? And we can construct further stimuli which would be ambiguous like that. So it is not something that you can unambiguously define. Unless it's a very simple signal, then we know what the pitch is. Okay, I've mentioned the active tuning happening. What's interesting here, phase locking, I kind of mentioned this. The interesting thing is that, well, here it says 5 kilohertz, but I've read actually 4 and 3 elsewhere as well. What you have is that above 3-4K already, you are not able to hear the pitch. Okay, so you can hear a constant frequency, evidently, but you will not be able to assign a pitch class to it. So you won't be able to say whether it's a C or a D, whether it's an octave above something or not. You hear a constant frequency, but you don't hear pitch, which kind of shows that pitch perception relies on phase locking much more than the tonotopical properties of the membrane. Because if you measure the phase locking, it actually breaks down at higher frequencies, just like our pitch perception breaks down. Okay, so a very high tone, you kind of lose the sense of what the pitch is, even though you hear it as a fixed frequency. Okay, so it doesn't have this musical relationship, right? And then you could get into this, story about what produces a sense of interval and why are intervals transposable. Okay, we don't have a similar transposition capacity. Maybe I shouldn't say this, because we can do kind of mental rotation of stuff. I was about to say that it's something we don't have in vision, definitely not in the tactile sense, probably not in the gustatory either. But the fact that we have a sense of interval which is independent of the absolute frequency is quite a puzzling phenomenon. And if you start to research about phase locking, you kind of get the idea, okay, so it's about the relationship. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because if I have a fifth interval, then what I will have with neurological triggering is that I will have 3 triggers and 2 triggers aligned such that after the cycle they realign. Okay, it's like your African, like 2 against 3, right? So that's what's happening in triggering, and that gives us a sensation of a fifth. So the sensation of a fifth will prevail regardless of the absolute frequency because the pattern of triggering remains the same. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense of what might be going on there. Okay. There's a few more things where I'm kind of in disagreement with the majority of psychoacousticians. The virtual pitch missing fundamental, again, you will find that people say that the auditory system, the brainstem, wherever, it replaces the missing information. I could not agree less. The point is that there is sufficient triggering. In fact, the funny thing, you probably know about missing fundamental, right? So if I have a complex spectrum of a harmonic spectrum of a tone, and if I remove the fundamental frequency, I still hear the pitch that relates to that missing fundamental, right? Now, it gets even funnier than that, because I can actually remove all the harmonics and keep only the fourth harmonic, which is actually a sine at a totally different frequency. But if I use this in a melodic context, so if I have a melody running, and one of these tones gets everything stripped off except one sine wave at a totally alien frequency, I will still hear the pitch that belongs to the melody. So it's not just one missing fundamental, it's missing everything except a single harmonic in a given situation. With some careful experiment design, you can actually achieve a total misperception, right? Because at that stage there is one frequency of a totally different frequency and you still hear that very pitch. There is a thing called acoustic afterimage. We've tried to do this, almost hurting our hearing in Hungary, and we didn't quite get it. Probably after Luke Vibert you may be able to get it. Okay, so Bark scale phones, this all gets kind of closer to the perception, and that time perception. Do we have any time left? Probably not. 2 minutes. I'm not sure what's really interesting. In any case, I have more detailed lectures on YouTube already on psychoacoustics. There's a whole lot of resource if you're interested. We talked about, didn't talk much about stream segregation. Peripheral channeling is your key term if you want to search and find out exciting stuff in this domain. And then localization, very complex thing. What is the best way to localize a sound? It's my anecdote. Move your head. Okay, so the interesting thing is that there is such tight interaction neurologically present that, you know, if I move my head, the sound source location does not move, while everything else moves.
What does it mean to localize a sound?
It means to accurately estimate the direction where it's coming from.
Is there a way to mislead your ear?
Oh yes, millions.
But like in the sense that, like, for example, if I think I hear something on my right ear and I hear something on my left ear, to switch it up?
That's a bit dramatic, I think, but we could work towards it, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, actually, the whole stereophonic reproduction is an illusion, right? So that if you want to get an academic job in this domain, you know, it's really interesting how deliberately you have to shape your sentences to, you know, avoid stupid assumptions in terms of localization, in terms of where the sound is coming from. Typically, a good advice is to use the term phantom image, right? Because these are all phantom images as soon as we get stereophonic or multi-channel sound reproduction. Blah blah, minimal audible range, precedence, Haas effect, we kind of talked about this. Distant estimation, this is a really interesting one. In fact, in the 80s, we already have a paper which says, oh, within 5 years, every digital mixer will have a distance spot. And 30 years later, nope. And it's actually one of the most crucial things. It's not horribly complex, difficult to put something at a larger distance. It is slightly more complex to pull something in closer to you in a studio. But actually what you should try to do is increase correlation of harmonics. Fancy talk. Auditory scene analysis, a lot of experiments here. Here you see A and B stimulus, A and B stimulus. The proximity will define many things. So this is all auditory scene analysis. We can produce a lot of conflicting cues. And then you're not building psychoacoustic experiments, but if you are, please go through this as well. Whole lot of references, and thank you for your attention. Any questions?
So many.
So many. We'll